My mother posted on social media that I abandoned her. 200 people commented cursing at me. I live 15 minutes away from her and visited her 3 days earlier. She didn't delete the post. The bluish glow of my phone illuminated my face inside the dark car while my fingers trembled, scrolling through the screen reading comment after comment from complete strangers calling me an ungrateful daughter, elder abandonment, family shame, and especially using words so cruel and violent that they made tears silently stream down my face, without me being able to control that devastating emotional reaction in the face of the public humiliation orchestrated by my own mother through a social media post that completely distorted our functional family reality, transforming it into a dramatic narrative of abandonment that simply didn't correspond to the objective facts of our respectful and frequent coexistence. My 37 years of life carefully built on foundations of family responsibility, honest work as a human resources manager at a logistics company, and especially on the comforting certainty that I maintained a healthy relationship with my mother, Donna Irene, visiting her regularly and ensuring all her needs were adequately met, instantly crumbled before that avalanche of hostile judgments coming from strangers who blindly believed the dramatic and completely false version she had publicly shared with her 3,000 followers on social media. The post itself was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, calculated to generate maximum public outrage against me, without technically mentioning explicit lies that could be easily refuted through objective evidence. Donna Irene had shared an old photo of herself sitting alone in the living room of the house where she'd lived for 30 years, looking sadly at the camera with an expression of devastating loneliness that she had clearly meticulously rehearsed before taking that dramatic selfie, accompanied by an extensive caption that said, word for word, "Another day alone in this empty house, waiting for my only daughter to remember that I'm 62 years old and need company. But it seems modern life is too busy to visit an elderly mother who sacrificed everything to raise a daughter who doesn't even call anymore to know if I'm alive or dead. Will I only matter when I'm in a coffin?" The strategic combination of emotionally manipulative photo, dramatic language loaded with victimization, and especially vague accusations ambiguous enough to avoid direct factual contestation, but specific enough to paint a clear picture of a negligent daughter abandoning a needy mother, had generated a massive emotional response from her followers who quickly transformed into a public tribunal condemning me without any knowledge about the objective reality of our family relationship. The devastating irony of that impossible situation was that I had visited Donna Irene exactly 3 days before that viral post. The previous Monday, I spent the entire afternoon at her house helping organize kitchen cabinets, bringing weekly groceries from the supermarket that she had specifically requested, including favorite brands of cookies and teas she consumed daily, and especially talking extensively about her daily life while we prepared together the dinner we shared before I returned to my own house located just 15 minutes away. During that perfectly normal and pleasant visit that lasted approximately 4 hours, Donna Irene had shown no sign of dissatisfaction with the frequency of my visits, didn't mention feeling lonely or abandoned, and especially seemed genuinely happy enjoying her daughter's company, while we performed simple domestic activities that had become a comforting ritual over the years since my father died 5 years ago, leaving her a widow but not alone because I maintained a constant and attentive presence ensuring her emotional and practical well-being through regular visits, daily phone calls, and especially immediate willingness to attend to any emergency need that might arise. But apparently 3 days between visits constituted cruel abandonment in the distorted perspective Donna Irene had chosen to present publicly on social media, completely ignoring decades of family dedication I had consistently demonstrated even while balancing demanding professional responsibilities, an 8-year marriage to Rodrigo, and especially my own mental health that required reasonable boundaries instead of the 24-hour availability she apparently secretly expected without ever explicitly communicating those impossible expectations. The feeling of being trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare where objective reality had been completely replaced by a false narrative, accepted as unquestionable truth by hundreds of people judging me, without knowing absolutely anything about my life or family relationship was absolutely suffocating and paralyzing, making me momentarily question whether perhaps I was really being a negligent daughter without realizing it, whether my family visitation patterns were objectively inadequate compared to some cultural ideal about filial devotion that I had failed to properly understand. How can she be doing this to me? I was literally at her house last Monday. I spent the whole afternoon with her. And now she's posting on social media that I abandoned her and letting hundreds of people curse at me without even trying to correct or contextualize it. I murmured to myself inside the dark car parked strategically 3 houses past Donna Irene's residence, because I couldn't confront her directly in that moment of absolute emotional confusion, but simultaneously needed to be physically close, trying to mentally understand what had motivated that cruel and apparently unprovoked public attack against my family reputation, carefully built over decades of responsible and dedicated behavior. My eyes burned from the tears that kept flowing involuntarily, while I obsessively reread the increasingly hostile comments, accumulating exponentially under Donna Irene's viral post. People who had never met me personally felt completely comfortable making absolute moral judgments about my character based exclusively on a unilateral narrative, carefully constructed to awaken maximum public outrage, without presenting any objective evidence or balanced context that could complicate the dramatic simplicity of the filial abandonment story she was efficiently selling to an audience eager for family scandals. The phone vibrated in my trembling hand, signaling the arrival of a new message that I initially ignored because I was completely absorbed processing the emotional trauma of that unexpected public attack. But a second vibration, quickly followed by a third, finally captured my attention enough to check who was attempting urgent contact on that impossible night. Rodrigo had sent a series of progressively worried messages asking where I was because I had left the house abruptly over an hour ago without explaining my destination or motive, followed by a screenshot of Donna Irene's viral post that apparently someone had shared on his timeline, accompanied by a comment questioning whether he knew his wife was the type of person who abandoned a needy elderly mother. The humiliation of discovering that public exposure had expanded beyond Donna Irene's immediate social circles, reaching even my own husband's social media, through acquaintances sharing the family scandal, as if it were casual entertainment instead of real trauma affecting living people with genuine feelings, was absolutely devastating, exponentially multiplying the emotional impact of that impossible situation. Rodrigo, I'm okay, but I need time alone processing a completely absurd situation that exploded on social media today, involving my mother posting lies about me abandoning her, even though I visited 3 days ago. I typed quickly, trying to provide the minimum information necessary to reassure him, without going into extensive details that would require emotional energy I simply didn't possess in that moment of absolute psychological exhaustion. I'm parked near her house trying to decide whether to confront directly or wait until tomorrow, when maybe I can control my emotions better and have a rational conversation instead of exploding in accusations that would only confirm her narrative about me being a problematic and aggressive daughter. Rodrigo's response arrived almost instantly, demonstrating genuine concern but also understandable confusion about possible motivations for Donna Irene to fabricate such an elaborate public drama, when the family relationship seemed to be working perfectly well based on all his observations during years of respectful coexistence with a mother. In law, he always treated kindly during regular visits and family celebrations. Marina, you need to come home now so we can talk properly about how to respond to this absurd post before the situation escalates even more through viral shares that will spread that false narrative to increasingly larger circles of people who will form permanent opinions about you based exclusively on your mother's distorted version. Rodrigo wrote with the characteristic pragmatism of his analytical personality that always prioritized practical solutions instead of prolonged emotional processing. Sitting in the car near her house processing trauma alone won't solve absolutely anything, and especially puts you at risk of making an impulsive confrontation that could really make the situation worse if your mother decides to film your emotional reaction to use as additional evidence, confirming the narrative about you being an out-of-control daughter. Rodrigo's sensible words penetrated through the emotional fog dominating my logical reasoning capacity, making me reluctantly recognize that remaining parked indefinitely obsessively rereading hostile comments was counterproductive behavior that only prolonged suffering without contributing to any constructive solution. I started the car reluctantly, beginning the 20-minute drive to my own house located in a quiet residential neighborhood where Rodrigo and I had established a comfortable and stable life over 8 years of marriage, characterized by respectful companionship and especially by the dramatic absence of serious family conflicts that made that current situation with Donna Irene even more shocking and inexplicable. During that solitary journey through dark streets illuminated only by spaced streetlights and occasional headlights from other vehicles, my mind obsessively reviewed each recent interaction with my mother, trying to identify warning signs I should have noticed, anticipating that public attack before it could cause so much irreversible damage to my personal and professional reputation. But honestly, reviewing the previous weeks of daily phone communications and regular weekly visits, I couldn't identify anything that remotely suggested Donna Irene was planning that type of cruel emotional sabotage against her own daughter, who maintained consistent dedication to her well-being despite all the competing demands for limited time and attention. The disturbing possibility that my mother might be experiencing some type of cognitive decline, affecting judgment about the consequences of social media actions, began gradually forming while I automatically drove through familiar routes I had navigated daily for years without requiring conscious thought. People 62 years old generally don't develop severe dementia, but certainly subtle changes in emotional processing and especially in understanding about privacy versus public exposure could partially explain why Donna Irene had chosen social media as a platform to express apparently genuine feelings of loneliness, instead of simply communicating directly with me through honest conversation about unmet emotional needs. Alternatively, perhaps that dramatic post was calculated manipulation specifically intended to punish me for some perceived offense I had inadvertently committed without realizing it. Or perhaps it was a desperate attempt to obtain attention and validation from an online audience that offered immediate emotional gratification through sympathetic comments instead of requiring the difficult work of building genuine intimacy through vulnerable communication with close family members. When I finally arrived home, I found Rodrigo anxiously waiting in the living room with his laptop open, showing an enlarged screenshot of Donna Irene's viral post, and especially the comments section that had grown exponentially during the hour I spent driving. It now had over 250 individual responses, almost all expressing moral outrage against me, with no one questioning the truthfulness or context of that one-sided narrative presented so dramatically. Rodrigo was a light-skinned brown man of 40, working as a financial analyst at a bank. His dark brown hair was always professionally styled, and especially his green eyes showed that combination of analytical intelligence and emotional capacity to offer genuine support during complex family crises without rushing to judgment about guilt or responsibility before examining all the evidence completely. Marina, we need to decide immediately how to respond publicly to this post before the narrative solidifies irreversibly in the perception of everyone who knows you through social media, Rodrigo declared with professional urgency as soon as I walked through the front door. I've already written a draft of a public response clarifying that you visited your mother last Monday and maintain regular contact through weekly visits and daily phone calls. But before posting anything, we need to carefully discuss strategy because the wrong response could easily make the situation worse by making you seem defensive or like you're attacking your mother publicly in a way that would only confirm the negative impressions people have already formed based on her original post. Rodrigo's methodical approach offered some comfort through a recovered sense of control over a situation that seemed to have completely escaped in the last few hours. But simultaneously, the need to strategically plan a public response as if it were a public relations campaign, instead of simply resolving a family misunderstanding through honest conversation, revealed how profoundly social media had transformed the nature of modern interpersonal conflicts. Rodrigo, before we respond publicly, I need to understand what motivated my mother to do this, because without understanding the fundamental causes, any response we give will just be reactive, dealing with symptoms instead of solving the underlying problems, I argued as I let myself fall exhausted onto the couch beside him. I'm going to call her now, and I'm going to demand an honest explanation about why she chose to publicly humiliate her own daughter through false accusations of abandonment, instead of simply calling me to say she'd like more frequent visits if she's really feeling lonely. I picked up my cell phone with hands still trembling slightly from the residual adrenaline of that emotionally devastating night, and dialed the number I had memorized decades ago when I was still a child, learning to make emergency phone calls in case I needed to contact my mother during temporary absences. Donna Irene answered after 4 rings with a voice that sounded surprisingly cheerful considering the drama she had orchestrated publicly just hours before, as if she were genuinely happy to receive a call from her daughter, instead of being aware of the emotional trauma she had caused through cruel public exposure. Marina, darling, what a surprise to receive your call so late. Is everything okay? She asked with a falsely innocent tone that completely ignored the giant elephant in the virtual room represented by the viral post that had generated hundreds of hostile comments directed against me. Her ability to feign casual normalcy while simultaneously keeping the defamatory post active on her social media, without showing any remorse or willingness to retract it, revealed a level of emotional dissociation or calculated manipulation that was genuinely disturbing coming from a person who should love and protect her own daughter instead of deliberately exposing her to public humiliation. Mom, are you really going to pretend you don't know exactly why I'm calling after posting on your social media that I abandoned you, generating over 200 comments from people cursing at me and calling me an ungrateful daughter? I responded with a controlled voice despite the growing fury boiling beneath the apparently calm surface. I visited you 3 days ago. I spent the entire afternoon helping organize closets and bringing the groceries you asked for. And now you're saying publicly to 3,000 followers that you don't care if you're alive or dead? The silence that followed my confrontation lasted approximately 5 seconds, but seemed like an eternity as I anxiously waited for some rational explanation, or at least an apology acknowledging that that post had been an error in judgment, caused by a difficult emotional moment that she now deeply regretted. But instead of the expected contrition, Donna Irene's response revealed a manipulative strategy even more elaborate than I had initially imagined. Marina, you're reacting in a completely exaggerated way to a simple post where I just expressed genuine feelings of loneliness that any elderly person living alone naturally experiences, she declared with the tone of a victim unfairly attacked. If you're feeling guilty reading that, maybe you should honestly reflect on whether you're really dedicating adequate time to your mother, who sacrificed everything to raise you, instead of attacking me for sharing vulnerable emotions with an online community that offers me the emotional support I apparently don't receive sufficiently from my own family. The audacious reframing characterizing the calculated defamatory post designed to generate public outrage as simply a vulnerable expression of legitimate feelings, and especially blaming my natural defensive reaction as the real problem instead of her original false accusations, was a classic manipulative maneuver that shifted responsibility completely from perpetrator to victim. Mom, you weren't simply expressing vulnerable feelings. You deliberately constructed a dramatic narrative suggesting I abandoned you, even though you know perfectly well that I maintain regular contact through weekly visits and daily phone calls, I contested with growing firmness. And especially you're letting hundreds of people attack me violently in the comments without making any effort to correct false impressions or provide balanced context about our family reality. This isn't vulnerable emotional expression. This is public manipulation designed to humiliate and punish me for some offense I still can't identify, because you've never directly communicated any dissatisfaction with our family dynamic until now exploding publicly on social media. Donna Irene sighed dramatically, as if she were dealing with a stubborn child refusing to accept responsibility for problematic behavior, instead of being a manipulative mother being justifiably confronted by a harmed daughter. Marina, if you really cared about my feelings instead of just worrying about your reputation on social media, you'd come here now to talk in person instead of attacking me on the phone as if I were a criminal for sharing life experiences on my own social media, she suggested with that particular tone I had learned to recognize over decades as an indicator of an emotional trap being set where any response from me would be interpreted as additional confirmation of my supposed failures as a dedicated daughter. You literally live 15 minutes away, but apparently calling to yell at me is more convenient than demonstrating filial love through the physical presence that elderly people really need, instead of superficial obligations fulfilled mechanically without genuine emotional investment. Rodrigo, your response is perfect, balancing the need to clarify the truth without escalating the conflict. But part of me deeply resists the idea of having to publicly defend my character against absurd accusations from my own mother, as if I were a defendant in a public court being judged by a jury of strangers on social media. I confessed, expressing the ambivalence I felt about participating in that theater of public exposure. Why should I dignify ridiculous accusations with a formal response, as if they had legitimacy deserving serious refutation, instead of simply being universally recognized as transparent emotional manipulation from a clearly problematic person? The rhetorical question revealed fundamental frustration about how social media had transformed power dynamics in interpersonal conflicts, where the person making dramatic public accusations automatically gained an advantage through initial attention regardless of truthfulness, forcing victims to choose between dignifying accusations with defensive responses or remaining silent, risking that silence would be interpreted as implicit admission of guilt. Rodrigo considered my philosophical objection before responding with characteristic pragmatism that prioritized practical results over abstract principles. Marina, I completely agree that ideally, you shouldn't have to publicly defend yourself against absurd accusations from a manipulative mother. But the practical reality is that hundreds of people have already formed negative opinions about you based exclusively on her narrative. And some of these people include professional colleagues, casual acquaintances, and especially potential future employers who could search your name online finding that viral post without any context, contradicting the initial negative impressions, he explained methodically. Responding publicly with a balanced factual statement isn't about dignifying her accusations, but about protecting your professional and personal reputation against lasting damage that could affect future opportunities in ways we can't completely predict, but that we certainly want to proactively minimize. After publishing the carefully worded statement on my own social media account, Rodrigo and I stayed up late into the night, anxiously monitoring the reactions that began arriving gradually, as friends and acquaintances read the factual clarification offering balanced perspective contrasting dramatically with Donna Irene's one-sided sensationalist narrative. The comments we received were mixed. Some expressed relief, understanding that there were clearly two sides to that story, and that they had rushed to judgment based on incomplete information. Others remained firmly convinced that where there's smoke, there's fire, suggesting that even if I visited regularly, perhaps the quality of those visits was inadequate, or that daily phone calls were mechanical fulfillment of obligations instead of genuine emotional connection. And especially some defended Donna Irene's right to express feelings on her own social media, without being policed or censored by a controlling daughter trying to manage public narratives about private family dynamics. The diversity of reactions demonstrated the fundamental complexity of how people interpret interpersonal conflicts through lenses of previous personal experiences, cultural biases about family obligations, and especially through social media algorithms that selectively amplified content generating maximum emotional engagement regardless of truthfulness or factual balance. During the days following that impossible night, the situation continued unfolding in increasingly bizarre and emotionally exhausting ways. Donna Irene didn't delete the original post despite the ultimatum I presented, but also didn't publish anything additional publicly escalating the conflict, creating a strange limbo where both contradictory narratives remain simultaneously accessible to anyone curious searching our names online. My sister Patricia eventually called after 3 days of awkward silence, revealing that she had also seen the viral post and was trying to mediate privately with Donna Irene to convince her to remove it, or at least edit it, adding balanced context, but was encountering stubborn resistance based on an abstract principle about freedom of emotional expression on social media that apparently superseded consideration for the feelings of the daughter being publicly humiliated. Patricia was my younger sister, 35 years old, working as a preschool teacher, with a naturally pacifying personality that always tried to mediate family conflicts while avoiding explicitly taking sides, even when situations clearly had objectively identifiable right and wrong parties. Marina, I tried to explain to Mom that that post is causing real suffering for you and damaging a reputation that took years to build through consistent professional behavior. But she's insisting that she has the right to share authentic emotional experiences on her own social media without being censored by concerns about how it affects other people. Patricia explained with evident frustration about her inability to make Donna Irene recognize the harmful impact of her actions. Honestly, I think she's enjoying the attention and validation she's receiving from online followers who are treating her like a courageous heroine exposing filial neglect. And that immediate emotional gratification is superseding any consideration for the real relationship with you that would require the difficult work of vulnerable communication instead of passive consumption of superficial solidarity from strangers. Patricia's insightful analysis of Donna Irene's underlying psychological motivations resonated painfully with my own growing suspicions that she had become addicted to the online validation that social media offers through quantifiable metrics of likes, shares, and supportive comments that create an illusion of intimacy and importance without requiring genuine vulnerability or emotional reciprocity, characteristic of deep, real relationships. Patricia, I need you to understand that I can't continue maintaining a normal relationship with a mother who chooses to deliberately humiliate me publicly instead of communicating emotional needs directly, regardless of how genuinely lonely she may feel, I declared, establishing a clear boundary that I knew would be difficult for my sister to accept because it implied a potential permanent fracture in our already small nuclear family. I've scheduled an appointment with a family therapist specializing in dysfunctional communication dynamics, and I've invited Mom to participate in a mediated session where we can discuss problematic patterns that need to be corrected before the damage becomes irreversible. If she refuses to participate, or if she participates but maintains a defensive posture without acknowledging the harmful impact of her choices, then I'll need to distance myself temporarily until she demonstrates the capacity for a healthy relationship based on direct communication instead of public manipulation. Patricia remained silent, processing the serious implications of that ultimatum that would potentially divide our small family, forcing her to navigate conflicting loyalties between mother and sister during an indefinite period of separation that none of us wanted, but seemed inevitable, given Aunt Irene's stubborn refusal to acknowledge responsibility for the damage caused. Marina, I completely support your decision to establish healthy boundaries and agree that family therapy is the appropriate next step in trying to resolve communication patterns that clearly aren't working adequately, Patricia finally responded, with appreciated fraternal solidarity. I'll talk to Mom today about the importance of participating in that therapy session, and I'll make it clear that her refusal would be interpreted by the entire family as a lack of commitment to preserving family relationships that should be an absolute priority compared to the fleeting satisfaction of online attention from strangers who will disappear the moment the next viral scandal captures the collective imagination. The consultation with Dr. Marcelo, a 53-year-old family therapist with graying hair at the temples and empathetic brown eyes that conveyed compassionate professionalism, was scheduled for the following Friday, offering enough time for Aunt Irene to decide whether she would participate voluntarily or force a more serious confrontation through refusal that would signal a lack of interest in resolving the conflict through professional mediation. During the days preceding the scheduled session, Aunt Irene remained strangely silent without making direct contact with me, but also without deleting the viral post that continued accumulating occasional comments from new discoverers sharing indignation about elder abandonment as if it were an abstract social problem instead of real trauma, affecting living people with complex stories not capturable in simplified narratives of 140 characters. The anxiety about whether Aunt Irene would show up for the therapy session or boycott it completely dominated my thoughts during that impossible week where I tried to maintain an appearance of professional normalcy at work, while internally processing the emotional turbulence of that family situation that had exploded publicly in ways I never imagined possible, in a family I had always considered reasonably functional, despite inevitable imperfections. On the morning of the Friday scheduled for family therapy, I woke up with my stomach churning from anticipatory anxiety about the inevitable emotional confrontation, regardless of whether Aunt Irene showed up or not. If she showed up, we would have painful mediated conversations about dysfunctional communication patterns, and especially about the emotional impact of the public humiliation she had orchestrated through social media. And if she didn't show up, I would be forced to confront the devastating reality of a mother choosing pride and online validation over preserving a relationship with her only daughter, who had demonstrated consistent dedication despite all inevitable human limitations. Rodrigo offered to accompany me to the session, providing emotional support during the potentially volatile therapeutic process. But I decided that first session should include only me, Aunt Irene, and Patricia, maintaining the original nuclear family dynamic without additional complications from spouses who could distract from fundamental issues about maternal-filial communication that needed to be addressed directly without additional mediators beyond the professional therapist. Dr. Marcelo's office was a welcoming space decorated with comfortable light wood furniture, lush green plants creating a calming organic atmosphere, and most importantly, an absence of visible clocks, signaling that therapeutic time operated at a different pace from external daily urgencies. I arrived 15 minutes before the scheduled time, wanting to ensure I would be present and composed when Aunt Irene and Patricia arrived, avoiding a dynamic where my late arrival could be interpreted as disrespect or lack of commitment to the therapeutic process. Patricia arrived exactly on time, alone, and the worried expression on her face immediately communicated the news I feared receiving. Aunt Irene had decided not to attend, sending a vague message to Patricia claiming she wasn't feeling well, but which was probably just a transparent excuse avoiding confrontation about behavior she knew would be impossible to defend rationally before a professional therapist trained in identifying emotional manipulations and dysfunctional communication patterns. Marina, Mom sent me a message an hour ago saying she has a severe migraine and won't be able to attend today, but would like to reschedule for next week when she's feeling better, Patricia reported with evident skepticism about the truthfulness of that conveniently coincidental medical excuse. I tried calling to confirm if she was really sick or just avoiding therapy, but she didn't answer the phone and only responded via text message insisting that the migraine was legitimate and that I should stop questioning her medical condition as if it were invented just to escape responsibilities. Aunt Irene's refusal to participate in the scheduled session confirmed my worst fears about a lack of genuine commitment to resolving the conflict through professionally mediated communication. Preferring to maintain the status quo where she could continue enjoying online validation, while avoiding the difficult work of honestly examining problematic behaviors and harmful impacts on a daughter she claimed to love, but apparently not enough to prioritize preserving the relationship over personal pride and the gratification of attention on social media. Dr. Marcelo invited Patricia and me to proceed with the session even in Aunt Irene's absence, explaining that often individual family members could benefit from family therapy, even when other key participants refused to attend, especially when the absence itself revealed patterns of avoidance that were an important component of overall dysfunctional dynamics. During the following hour, Dr. Marcelo guided Patricia and me through a careful exploration of family history, identifying long-standing patterns where Aunt Irene had used indirect communication techniques, including dramatic victimization, messages through third parties instead of direct conversations, and most importantly, resistance to accepting responsibility for the emotional impacts of her choices. Preferring to recharacterize others' natural reactions as their problems instead of logical consequences of her behaviors. The reconciliation visit the following day was an emotionally complex experience where Aunt Irene and I carefully navigated around sensitive topics while gradually rebuilding trust through simple shared activities and conversation about everyday matters that demonstrated genuine interest in each other's lives, instead of simply fulfilling family obligations mechanically. During lunch preparation together in the kitchen, where so many family memories had been created over decades, Aunt Irene finally offered something approaching a genuine apology, though characteristically indirect. "Marina, I realize that sometimes I express feelings in ways that end up hurting people I love, when the real intention is just to communicate emotional needs that I don't know how to express directly without drama," she admitted with uncommon vulnerability. "I'll try to improve at saying clearly when I'm feeling lonely instead of making dramatic posts on social media hoping you'll magically guess what I need." The promise was modest, but represented genuine progress toward healthier communication patterns that Dr. Marcello had identified as fundamental to lasting functionality of the family relationship. "Mom, I also recognize that I could be more proactive in regularly asking about how you're feeling emotionally, instead of just focusing on practical needs like shopping and household tasks. I contributed with my own admission of areas deserving improvement. Let's establish a new routine where, in addition to normal weekly visits, we do longer video calls twice a week specifically dedicated to deep emotional conversations about how we're really feeling, instead of just superficial updates about daily activities." The concrete proposal offered structure that could prevent future misunderstandings through regular, intentional communication, creating dedicated spaces for emotional vulnerability that was often neglected in casual interactions focused mainly on logistics and practical problem solving. Aunt Irene enthusiastically accepted that proposal, demonstrating that a genuine desire for deeper connection had been underlying the unnecessary social media dramatics. But she simply hadn't developed direct communication skills to express those needs in healthy ways without resorting to manipulations that ended up damaging relationships she valued. In the months following that careful reconciliation, Aunt Irene and I gradually rebuilt trust through consistent implementation of the communication routine we had established, and especially through eventual participation in additional family therapy sessions with Dr. Marcello. That helped develop practical skills for communicating emotional needs without unnecessary drama or manipulation. The viral post that had caused so much suffering eventually disappeared from the collective consciousness of social media, as algorithms moved inexorably to the next scandals and dramas, capturing the fleeting attention of online audiences hungry for consumable emotional content. The most important lesson I learned through that devastating experience was that healthy family relationships require consistent direct communication about emotional needs instead of assuming that love alone automatically translates into telepathic understanding of unexpressed feelings, and especially that social media can be dangerous tools amplifying misunderstandings, transforming private resolvable conflicts into public spectacles, consumed by unknown crowds who judge without complete context, causing lasting damage to reputations carefully built over entire lifetimes, dedicated to responsible and respectful behavior. 3 months after that reconciliation lunch that officially marked the end of the painful estrangement between me and Aunt Irene, I realized that something fundamental had changed not only in our family relationship, but especially in my own understanding about healthy boundaries and emotional responsibility in complex interpersonal dynamics, involving people we love, but who simultaneously demonstrate potentially harmful behavior patterns requiring constant vigilance, instead of blind trust based on idealistic assumptions about family love being automatically unconditional and safe, regardless of concrete actions that might contradict those comforting suppositions. The most significant transformation manifested in how I responded internally when Aunt Irene occasionally slipped into old patterns of indirect communication or emotional dramatics. Instead of immediately assuming guilt or responsibility for her feelings, as I had done automatically for previous decades, I now consciously paused, examining whether those expressed feelings represented legitimate needs deserving compassionate response, or whether they represented manipulative attempts at emotional control that I had the right and responsibility to explicitly recognize by establishing firm boundaries protecting my own mental health, instead of sacrificing it infinitely on the altar of superficial family harmony built on foundations of unilateral capitulation. the implementation of the twice weekly video call routine specifically dedicated to deep emotional conversations had radically transformed the quality of our communication. Compared to the previous pattern where interactions focused predominantly on practical logistics and resolution of material problems, while completely neglecting emotional dimensions that Aunt Irene had apparently been anxious to express, but didn't possess the skills or confidence to articulate directly, without resorting to dramatic, indirect methods that ended up pushing away instead of bringing closer. During those structured conversations where we both agreed beforehand to focus exclusively on feelings and emotional experiences, instead of just reporting factual events, Aunt Irene gradually developed a more sophisticated vocabulary for naming complex internal states that previously only emerged through dramatic outbursts or ambiguous social media posts designed to indirectly communicate needs she didn't know how to express frontally. Marina, I've been thinking a lot about why I made that terrible post that almost destroyed our relationship. And honestly, I think it was because I didn't know how to simply say I was feeling irrelevant in your busy life without sounding like a needy mother making impossible demands on your limited time. Aunt Irene shared during one of those video call sessions, approximately 4 months after the initial reconciliation. The genuine vulnerability of that admission contrasted dramatically with the defensiveness and denial that had characterized initial conversations after the social media incident, suggesting that the therapeutic work with Dr. Marcello was gradually producing real changes in Aunt Irene's capacity for honest self-reflection instead of just defensive rationalization, protecting a fragile ego against recognizing responsibility for damage caused. Mom, I deeply appreciate that honesty about underlying motivations because it helps me understand that that post wasn't a malicious attack against me specifically, but rather a desperate and deeply misguided attempt to communicate legitimate emotional needs that you didn't know how to express constructively, I responded, validating her vulnerability while simultaneously maintaining clarity that the specific behavior had been inappropriate regardless of understandable motivations. But I need you to understand that even with understandable motivations, the choice to publicly expose on social media instead of communicating directly with me caused real serious damage that took significant time to repair, and especially established a concerning precedent where private family conflicts became public entertainment, consumed by strangers who formed permanent opinions about my character, based exclusively on your one-sided narrative without balanced context. Donna Irene nodded gravely, demonstrating genuine understanding about the seriousness of those consequences, instead of minimizing or rationalizing as she had done consistently during the initial weeks after the original incident. Marina, I solemnly promise that I will never again use social media as a platform to express frustrations about our family relationship. And most importantly, I promise that whenever I'm feeling lonely or neglected, I will call you directly saying exactly that instead of making ambiguous posts hoping you'll magically guess through indirect clues. She declared with conviction that seemed genuine, although I remained cautiously skeptical about the durability of that commitment, considering decades of deeply rooted behavioral patterns that don't simply disappear through well-intentioned promises without constant vigilance and reinforcement through consistent actions over prolonged time. The therapy with Dr. Marcello had emphasized the importance of validating genuine progress while simultaneously maintaining realistic expectations about the inevitability of occasional slips that shouldn't be interpreted as complete failures, but rather as opportunities to practice newly learned skills of repair and direct communication about violations of established boundaries. During those months of careful reconstruction, I faced the additional challenge of repairing reputational damages that the viral post had caused in broader professional and social circles, where people who knew me only superficially had formed negative impressions based exclusively on that dramatic narrative, without ever hearing my balanced perspective about the objective reality of our family relationship. Some friendships proved surprisingly resilient. People who had genuinely known me for enough years to have directly observed consistent patterns of responsible behavior automatically questioned the veracity of dramatic accusations, recognizing inconsistency with everything they knew about my character through accumulated direct experiences. Juliana was particularly instrumental not only providing technical analysis about social media dynamics, but mainly offering public testimony on her own timeline about having personally observed over the years my consistent dedication to Donna Irene's well-being, including specific examples that directly contradicted the narrative of abandonment that had been virally propagated. I met Marina 8 years ago through volunteer work at a charitable institution, and during all that time I witnessed countless occasions where she adjusted personal plans to attend to her mother's needs, including canceling a vacation trip planned Months in advance, when Donna Irene had severe flu and needed temporary intensive care, Juliana wrote in a public post that tagged my account, offering balanced context for anyone curious searching my name online. The invasion of that private family drama into the professional sphere represented a disturbing escalation that I hadn't fully anticipated when initially focusing exclusively on repairing the relationship with Donna Irene without adequately considering ramifications in other areas of life. That operated on completely different logics from emotional family dynamics. I scheduled an urgent meeting with my direct supervisor, proactively explaining the complete situation, including factual context about the real frequency of visitation, and mainly about the manipulative nature of the post that had distorted objective reality, transforming a functional family relationship into a dramatic narrative of neglect that simply didn't correspond to verifiable facts. Marina, I appreciate that you came directly to clarify this situation instead of allowing rumors to circulate without contestation. And most importantly, I want you to know that the company values your exceptional work during the 5 years you've been with us and won't form opinions about professional character based on dramatic social media posts without adequate context. My supervisor responded with reassuring professionalism, although I detected subtle hesitation suggesting that reputational damages had already occurred regardless of official reassurances about continued trust. The cruel reality was that even well-intentioned people who consciously rejected forming hasty judgments based on unverified rumors were still subconsciously influenced by repeated exposure to negative narratives, creating implicit biases that affected perceptions and decisions in ways that nobody explicitly recognized, but that accumulated into material disadvantages over time. Carlos, my sister Patricia's husband, had maintained notable distance during the entire family drama, revealing evident discomfort with emotional complexities that he preferred to avoid completely, instead of navigating through direct engagement that would require taking positions potentially alienating either mother-in-law or sister-in-law, depending on which side he chose to explicitly support. During a family dinner that we organized approximately 5 months after the initial reconciliation, attempting to restore some appearance of normalcy in traditional celebrations that had been suspended during the estrangement period, Carlos finally broke his habitual silence, offering an external male perspective that Patricia and I hadn't adequately considered in our analyses predominantly focused on maternal-filial emotional dynamics. Marina, as a man observing this situation from outside without emotional baggage of decades of family history, I honestly think that both you and Donna Irene were operating in completely different emotional languages, where she expected demonstrations of affection through constant physical presence, while you demonstrated love through practical action solving material problems. And most importantly, neither communicated explicitly those different expectations, causing accumulated frustration on both sides that eventually exploded destructively through that social media post. He offered with analytical perspective that resonated uncomfortable truth about shared responsibilities in misunderstandings that I had been resisting fully acknowledging, preferring a simpler narrative where I was an innocent victim of unilateral maternal manipulation. Carlos's observation forced deeper reflection about my own communication patterns that perhaps had inadvertently contributed to feelings of emotional disconnection that Donna Irene experienced even during the period when I believed I was adequately fulfilling family obligations through regular visits and practical assistance. Perhaps I had been so focused on efficiency of solving material needs during weekly visits that I completely neglected creating spaces for genuine emotional intimacy, where Donna Irene felt truly seen and valued as a complex person with rich inner life, instead of just passive recipient of filial services performed mechanically fulfilling social obligations, instead of emanating from authentic connection and genuine curiosity about her experiences and feelings. The self-criticism didn't absolve Donna Irene of responsibility for choosing a destructive method of communicating frustration through public humiliation instead of direct conversation, but it honestly recognized that the dysfunctional dynamic resulted from interactional patterns developed collaboratively over years, where both failed to explicitly communicate needs and expectations, preferring to assume the other should magically intuit through indirect clues instead of clear articulation that would prevent accumulation of silent resentments eventually exploding dramatically. 1 full year after that viral post that had almost permanently destroyed our relationship, Donna Irene and I sat together in her living room, sharing tea, while reflecting on the transformative journey we had traversed since that impossible night when 200 people were cursing me in comments based on a dramatic narrative of abandonment that completely distorted our family reality. Marina, Looking back, I realized that terrible post was simultaneously the worst and best thing that could have happened to our relationship. Worst because it caused tremendous unnecessary suffering and serious reputational damages that took months to repair, but best because it finally forced us to confront dysfunctional communication patterns we had been avoiding for decades. Allowing resentments to accumulate silently to the point of inevitable rupture, Donna Irene reflected with wisdom that surprised considering the stubborn resistance she had initially demonstrated in acknowledging any responsibility for the crisis her actions had precipitated. If I could go back in time, I would obviously choose not to make that post and instead communicate directly that I was feeling lonely and disconnected. But given that I can't undo the past, I can only be grateful that crisis forced changes that transformed our relationship into something genuinely deeper and more authentic, instead of superficially cordial but emotionally empty, as it had been during previous years. Donna Irene's capacity to find redemptive meaning in traumatic experience demonstrated growing emotional maturity that therapy had helped cultivate, and most importantly, revealed that she was genuinely invested in maintaining progress instead of simply performing. Superficial commitment until therapeutic attention diminished, allowing regression to comfortable old patterns. Mom, I agree that in retrospect, that crisis forced growth that probably never would have occurred through natural gradual evolution. But I also need to honestly say that I still carry emotional scars from that public humiliation that sometimes resurface when I see old comments occasionally resurfacing through searches, or when I meet people who clearly still associate my name with that narrative of filial neglect without knowing the complete context that eventually emerged. I shared honestly about lasting impacts that persisted despite successful reconciliation in the direct family relationship. Part of the healing process for me involves accepting that some consequences of that public exposure will permanently remain part of my personal history, and most importantly, that the reputation I spent decades building was damaged in ways that will never be completely repaired, regardless of how much work we invest in later clarifications and contextualizations. Donna Irene nodded gravely, demonstrating understanding about the seriousness of those lasting consequences, instead of minimizing or suggesting I should simply get over it and forget as she had done initially when confronted about the real impacts of her choices. Marina, I will carry guilt for those permanent damages for the rest of my life, and the only consolation I can offer beyond the apologies I've already expressed repeatedly is absolute commitment to never repeat that mistake, and most importantly, to work tirelessly to be the kind of mother who deserves trust and respect through consistent actions over time, instead of simply intentioned words without corresponding behavioral substance. She responded with genuine humility that contrasted dramatically with the proud defensiveness that had characterized initial interactions after the original incident. The progress was real and measurable, not only through words, but mainly through concrete behavioral changes that accumulated into substantial transformation of relational dynamics that both explicitly recognized appreciating instead of taking for granted or natural. Rodrigo observed that transformation with evident satisfaction as someone who had witnessed the entire journey from the initial traumatic night to gradual reconciliation and, most importantly, to consolidation of new, healthier patterns that seemed sustainable over the long term, instead of simply temporary improvements motivated by guilt or fear of consequences that would disappear once external pressures diminished. Marina, I'm genuinely impressed with the courage you and your mother demonstrated by committing to the difficult therapeutic process, instead of simply sweeping problems under the rug pretending everything returned to normal, without doing the real work of examining and correcting underlying patterns that had created conditions for that destructive explosion. Rodrigo commented during dinner celebrating the 1-year anniversary of reconciliation that we symbolically celebrated, marking the distance traveled since that devastating crisis. Many families facing similar conflicts choose the easier path of simply resuming superficial contact without ever addressing fundamental issues, and then inevitably repeat destructive cycles because root causes were never really resolved, just temporarily suppressed until the next explosion. Rodrigo's reflection about choices we had made to invest in difficult therapeutic work instead of easy, superficial reconciliation validated emotional and financial sacrifices that process had demanded during an entire year of regular sessions with Dr. Marcelo, costing substantial time and money, but producing genuine transformation that broadly justified those investments. Patricia and Carlos had also occasionally participated in sessions when extended family dynamics were relevant, and most importantly, Patricia had substantially benefited from insights about her own communication patterns with Donna Irina that she began proactively correcting before they created problems similar to what I had experienced. Watching you two work through that terrible conflict taught me valuable lessons about the importance of direct communication that I'm applying preventively in my own relationship with mom, establishing clear expectations, and most importantly, verbalizing needs explicitly instead of assuming she should intuit through indirect clues. Patricia shared, demonstrating that positive impacts of that crisis extended beyond just me and Donna Irene, benefiting the extended family through modeling constructive conflict resolution instead of avoidance or destructive escalation. Juliana continued to be a source of emotional support and especially professional perspective on social media dynamics that helped contextualize the traumatic experience within broader patterns of how digital platforms transform interpersonal conflicts by dramatically amplifying them through algorithms that prioritize emotional engagement instead of factual accuracy or narrative balance. Marina, your case is a perfect example of a phenomenon I observe professionally constantly. People using social media as a stage to perform personal dramas, seeking validation from audiences who don't possess adequate context to make informed judgments, but who enthusiastically offer absolute opinions based on narrative fragments carefully selected for maximum emotional impact. Juliana explained during lunch, celebrating the successful resolution of a saga that had consumed an entire year of our lives. What makes your case particularly interesting from a professional standpoint is that you navigated the response in an exemplary way. You published a balanced factual clarification without falling into the trap of dramatically counter-attacking, established firm boundaries about not participating in cycles of public accusations, and most importantly, invested energy in resolving the underlying problem through therapy instead of just managing superficial appearances on social media, which is the strategy that most people incorrectly choose. Juliana's professional recognition of having navigated the situation appropriately offered appreciated external validation, especially considering how many times during that year I had questioned whether I was making the right choices or if I should have responded more aggressively, defending my reputation through detailed public counter-attacks instead of a brief statement followed by digital silence, focusing energy on private resolution through appropriate therapeutic channels. The temptation to engage in public battles on social media had been intense, especially during the initial weeks when hostile comments kept accumulating, and especially when I discovered that screenshots were circulating in professional contexts, potentially harming the career I had meticulously built through consistent performance over years. Resisting that temptation by choosing silent dignity instead of dramatic defense had required substantial discipline, but in retrospect, it had clearly been the right choice, allowing focus to remain on genuine resolution instead of public performance of victimization or revenge that would only have fueled an endless cycle of drama voraciously consumed by online audiences, but not contributing to any real healing of the family relationship that genuinely mattered, regardless of the opinions of unknown strangers. Dr. Marcello, during the final family therapy session, approximately 13 months after the start of the process, offered professional analysis about the progress we had achieved, and especially about the sustainability of the changes implemented, suggesting that we were ready to graduate from regular therapy, maintaining only occasional check-ins as needed for skill reinforcement or navigation of new challenges that would inevitably arise. Marina and Mrs. Irene, the work you've done during the last year represents a rare, genuine transformation that I see in only a small percentage of families I treat professionally, he praised with evident sincerity. Most people make superficial progress sufficient to reduce immediate conflict, but don't really invest in examining and correcting deep relational patterns that created conditions for the original conflict, inevitably resulting in regression as soon as therapeutic pressure decreases. You've demonstrated genuine commitment, not just in resolving the specific crisis, but in developing fundamentally new skills that have transformed the quality of your relationship in a way that will probably be sustainable over future decades, as long as you continue practicing consciously, instead of allowing gradual complacency as memories of initial pain fade with time. Dr. Marcello's words about sustainability were simultaneously encouraging about the progress achieved and also sober warnings about the need for continuous vigilance, practicing skills consciously, instead of assuming that transformation was permanent and automatic, not requiring deliberate maintenance. Mrs. Irene and I agreed to continue the routine of video calls twice weekly, indefinitely recognizing that this structure had become fundamental in maintaining deep emotional communication that prevented silent accumulations of resentments that had previously created conditions for destructive explosion. Additionally, we committed to annual check-ins with Dr. Marcello, functioning as preventive maintenance, identifying early any slips into old patterns before they accumulated into serious problems requiring intensive intervention again. The proactive approach to relational maintenance instead of just reactive intervention during crises represented a fundamental shift in how we conceptualized family relationship. Instead of assuming it should function automatically through natural love, we explicitly recognized that healthy relationships require continuous conscious work through intentional communication, deliberate vulnerability, and especially willingness to examine and correct problematic patterns as soon as they emerge instead of allowing gradual deterioration to the breaking point. Today, 2 years after that impossible night when 200 people were cursing at me based on Mrs. Irene's viral post, I can honestly say that the relationship we have now is qualitatively superior to what existed before that crisis, even considering the trauma and damage that experience caused. The authenticity and emotional depth we developed through difficult therapeutic work created genuine intimacy that had never existed previously. When the relationship functioned superficially, through mechanical fulfillment of obligations, without really knowing or being known in vulnerable dimensions that true connection requires. Ms. Irene now knows aspects of my inner life that I had never shared previously because I didn't trust they would be received with acceptance instead of judgment, and I now understand complexities of her emotional experience as a person beyond simply the role of mother, which had been the only dimension I had previously allowed her to occupy in my limited understanding. The transformation didn't erase scars from that public humiliation that occasionally still resurface, causing residual pain. When I encounter old comments or when people who don't know the complete story make references to that incident based on partial knowledge of the original narrative without context of subsequent resolution. But I learned to live with those scars, recognizing they're part of a complex story that transformed me into a wiser person about boundaries, communication, and especially about complexities of family relationships that are never as simple as cultural idealizations suggest. The deepest lesson I carried from that devastating experience transcends the specifics of individual conflict with Mrs. Irene, applying broadly to how we navigate all significant relationships in the social media era, where the temptation to perform private dramas for public audiences offers immediate gratifications through superficial validation from strangers but causes lasting damage to real relationships that should be prioritized infinitely more than approval from unknown people who will never know or genuinely care about the complete complexities of lives they judge so easily, based on narrative fragments consumed casually among countless other content competing for limited attention. Social media has fundamentally transformed how interpersonal conflicts develop and resolve, creating new dynamics where public humiliation can be inflicted instantly through a few clicks. But reparation requires prolonged, arduous work that online audiences rarely witness or appreciate, because genuine resolution doesn't offer the same dramatic gratification that initial explosions provide. Choosing to resolve conflicts through direct, private communication instead of public exposure requires countercultural discipline, resisting platform norms that reward drama through engagement metrics while making invisible the silent work of reparation that rebuilds damaged relationships through mutual vulnerability and sustained commitment. Did you enjoy Marina's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.